Welcome to the Human History Channel. Today, we're diving into the 13 days that nearly destroyed the world. October 1962. On the U-2 screens, clear silhouettes of missile installations on Cuban soil. In Washington and Moscow, silence taut as a bowstring. And in the Atlantic, a submarine cut off from command, where 3 officers decide whether to press the button capable of wiping civilization off the face of the Earth. This isn't a movie. This is the Cuban Missile Crisis. The moment when humanity first peered into the abyss of nuclear war and, miraculously, stepped back. The Caribbean crisis of October 1962 is one of the most studied and at the same time least understood episodes of the Cold War. This was a period when the world was on the brink of full-scale nuclear war, caused by the deployment of Soviet ballistic missiles on Cuban territory. The presented study offers a comprehensive analysis of this historical event. The purpose of the report is to provide an exhaustive chronology of events, covering diplomatic negotiations, military escalation, and the internal political dynamics of the United States of America, the Soviet Union, and Cuba. To achieve this goal, the chronology is presented in 2 complementary formats: a detailed daily chronicle of the climax phase of the crisis, and a structured description of the key stages of its development, starting from the preceding events and ending with the long-term consequences. This approach allows not only to trace the temporal sequence, but also to understand the cause and effect relationships, the motives of the leaders' actions, and the strategic calculations of the parties that brought the world to the brink of catastrophe and allowed it to be avoided. Although the Caribbean crisis is traditionally associated with October 1962, its origins go back much further, to the period from 1958 to 1962. Understanding these early stages is critically important for analyzing the motives and strategic calculations underlying the crisis. The idea of placing Soviet nuclear weapons in Cuba was not an improvisation, but the result of Nikita Khrushchev's long-term foreign policy, aimed at correcting the so-called missile balance, strengthening his authority within the Soviet Union and among socialist allies, as well as protecting the young Cuban Revolution from the threat of invasion by the United States of America. Khrushchev's strategic vision was to use Cuba, located just a few hundred miles from the coast of the United States of America, as a kind of forward base against the American continent. This step seemed to him a terrible risk, which he was willing to take to achieve strategic goals. First, he sought to level the advantage of the United States of America in deploying missiles on foreign territories, such as Turkey and Italy, which could strike Soviet cities. Placing missiles in Cuba allowed the nuclear isthmus border to be brought closer to American shores, which theoretically could create more equal conditions for disarmament negotiations. Second, for Khrushchev, support for Fidel Castro's Cuban regime was an important element of his policy in Latin America, demonstrating the Soviet Union's ability to exert influence far beyond the traditional European sphere of interests. Success in this direction was supposed to strengthen his own power within the Politburo and show the weakness of President Kennedy's administration, which after the failure of the Bay of Pigs operation was perceived as unable to effectively counter the communist threat. Thus, the Cuban problem became for Khrushchev an opportunity to solve several internal and foreign policy tasks at once. The internal political situation in the United States of America also played its role. After the unsuccessful Bay of Pigs operation in 1961, the Kennedy administration faced serious criticism and loss of authority. The discovery of Soviet missiles on the neighboring island became a direct challenge for him, requiring a decisive response to demonstrate the country's strength and unity in the face of an external threat. Internal political calculations, including the upcoming November elections, where the Democrats won an unexpected victory, likely influenced decision-making. At the same time, within the Soviet leadership, there were concerns about the consequences of such a step, which made the entire operation even more risky. Practical preparations for missile deployment began long before the summer of 1962. However, the decisive stage began in 1962. In particular, already on the 19th of October 1962, the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America conducted a joint assessment of the Soviet missile threat in Cuba, which indicates a high level of tension and constant monitoring of the situation. Preparations for the deployment itself were laid even earlier. For example, documents mention ships that left Soviet ports in October 1962 with equipment and missiles intended for deployment in Cuba. The deployment process itself became a secret known only to a narrow circle of people in Moscow and Havana. The Cuban leadership, headed by Fidel Castro, actively participated in this process. Cuba's military sector, which emerged from the guerrilla army that overthrew dictator Fulgencio Batista, was involved in the defense of the island. For the Cuban government, living in constant fear of a new invasion by the United States of America, the presence of Soviet missiles was the only reliable guarantee of the regime's survival. The Cuban leadership was ready to do anything to protect the revolution, which included using the missiles. It is interesting to note that Castro even urged Khrushchev to use tactical nuclear warheads in the event of an invasion by the United States of America, demonstrating readiness for extreme measures. Thus, the period from 1959 to 1962 represents a complex process of forming a strategic alliance driven by mixed motives. Khrushchev sought strategic advantage and strengthening of his power. Kennedy sought to restore the authority of the United States of America, and Castro to ensure the security of his revolution. This multi-layered background created ideal conditions for any minor mistake or misunderstanding to lead to catastrophe. Operation Anadr, as the code name for the missile deployment project in Cuba, was launched, and its consequences were to become evident by the end of October 1962. The period from the 14th to the 22nd of October 1962 marks the transition from a long-term strategic game to a direct and extremely dangerous confrontation. This stage is characterized by the discovery of the missiles, the formation of the American response, the beginning of secret negotiations, and the buildup of military readiness by both superpowers. It was during these days that the world first found itself on the brink of direct nuclear conflict, provoked by the presence of Soviet medium-range missile complexes in Cuba. The key event was on the 14th of October 1962, when American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft took photographs that subsequently confirmed the presence of medium-range missile launchers in Cuba. This information became the starting point for the entire subsequent history. The next day, on the 15th of October, President John Fitzgerald Kennedy was informed about the content of the photographs. He immediately realized the colossal scale of the threat. Missiles capable of striking most of the continental United States of America were installed literally a few hours' flight from American shores. This was perceived as an act of aggression and a direct violation of the unspoken non-interference agreement that existed between the two countries. The next day, on the 16th of October, Kennedy learned about the presence of missiles in Cuba. He immediately convened a meeting that received the name Executive Committee of the National Security Council, ExComm. This was a narrow circle of 10 people, including cabinet members, high-ranking military officials, and national security advisors. The first ExComm meeting took place on the 17th of October, and it was there that a fierce and prolonged debate began about what course the administration should take. The committee members were divided into several groups. One group, which included some military leaders, advocated the use of force, whether air strikes on missile bases or a full-scale invasion of the island. Another group, including, for example, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, preferred softer methods, such as economic pressure or blockade without the use of force. Others proposed a combined approach, combining military pressure with diplomatic ultimatums. These internal disagreements reflected the overall uncertainty and fear of any step that could lead to irreversible consequences. In parallel with this, the Soviet side continued its actions. Even before American intelligence received final confirmation, Soviet ships with missiles and military personnel were already en route to Cuba. Moscow refused to acknowledge the presence of missiles on the island, stating that supplies to the Cuban people were limited to defensive weapons. This duality in behavior was Khrushchev's attempt to play on both fronts, to maintain a strategic surprise for the United States of America and at the same time have the opportunity to deny accusations if the threat was discovered. During this tense period, the role of third parties as communication channels intensified. Although there were no official negotiations yet, indirect contacts were underway. For example, there is information about attempts at Track 2 dialogue through private individuals, such as journalist and pacifist Norman Cousins, who tried to act as a link between Washington and Moscow. The involvement of other international figures, such as a representative of the World Peace Council, is also mentioned, indicating the complexity of the multipolar nature of the crisis and the search for resolution paths at all levels. The culmination of this period was President Kennedy's decision. After nearly a week of discussions and evaluation of all options, he made a decision that was supposed to demonstrate the resolve of the United States of America, but leave room for a diplomatic exit. On the 22nd of October 1962, in an evening address to the nation, Kennedy announced the establishment of a naval quarantine around Cuba. He informed the American people and the world about the presence of medium and long-range missile launchers on the island, stated that the United States of America would not allow their completion and would not permit the delivery of new missiles, and announced the beginning of a full-scale inspection of Soviet and other ships attempting to break through to Cuba. This decision was both a military and a diplomatic act. On one hand, it represented direct military pressure that could easily escalate into armed conflict. On the other hand, it left the Soviet leadership a last chance to retreat without losing face. The president's address was intended to garner support from American society and allies, presenting the situation as a necessary measure of self-defense. Thus, by the 22nd of October 1962, the crisis reached a point of no return. The phase of maximum escalation began, in which each subsequent step by both sides became increasingly risky. The period from the 23rd to the 28th of October 1962 became the most tense in human history. Against the backdrop of the American naval blockade and the ongoing deployment of Soviet missiles in Cuba, the parties conducted fierce negotiations, being on the brink of direct military confrontation. This stage is characterized by active diplomatic activity, critical moments on the battlefield, and internal political calculations of the leaders who weighed every step on the edge of nuclear catastrophe. Starting from the 23rd of October, Soviet ships encountered American destroyers guarding the blockade line. Some ships stopped and turned back, but one, carrying equipment, continued on its way. This caused a wave of anxiety in the American command, which expected that any of these ships might be carrying missiles. Tension reached its peak when American troops were placed on high alert, and plans for an invasion of Cuba were brought to readiness. At the same time, active correspondence was underway between Kennedy and Khrushchev. 10 letters written by the leaders to each other from the 22nd to the 28th of October became a key communication tool. They reflected a complex and constantly changing picture of relations, where rigidity in one paragraph coexisted with conciliatory notes in another. Particularly indicative was the 26th of October, when Kennedy received a letter from Khrushchev, in which the Soviet leader proposed to publicly agree to withdraw Soviet missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public commitment by the United States of America not to invade the island. This proposal seemed reasonable and a logical way out of the crisis. However, the next day, on the 27th of October, the situation became more complicated. Within one day, Kennedy received 2 letters from Khrushchev. The first, published that same day, repeated the previous proposal. But the second, received later, was much harsher. In it, Khrushchev demanded that the United States of America first withdraw its missiles from Turkey before agreeing to withdraw its missiles from Cuba. This new condition put the American leadership in a difficult position. Fulfilling this demand was politically impossible, as it would mean public acknowledgement that the United States of America was retreating under pressure. Moreover, it could cause a wave of protests in Turkey and among NATO allies. This paradox, when Kennedy received 2 different letters from one leader in one day, became a critical moment of the crisis. The ExComm meeting that day was particularly tense, and the committee members discussed how to respond to the second, more demanding letter. Ultimately, Kennedy decided to ignore the harsh conditions of the second letter and respond to the first, more constructive proposal, adding a secret additional sheet to the letter in which the United States of America pledged to subsequently consider the issue of withdrawing missiles from Turkey. This move allowed Khrushchev to save face, but not make this condition a formal requirement for ending the crisis. Pressure from the military and conservative forces within the American government continued to grow. Some military commanders believed it was necessary to strengthen the blockade and be prepared for immediate invasion. However, Kennedy, being an experienced politician, understood that any direct military contact could quickly spiral out of control. He was ready to compromise to avoid war. His decision not to respond to Khrushchev's harsh conditions was dictated by both strategic wisdom and an understanding of the internal political landscape of the United States of America. However, the most dramatic episode that nearly led to catastrophe occurred on the 27th of October, a day that later became known as Black Saturday. It was on this day that several incidents took place that barely avoided uncontrollable escalation. First, An American U-2, piloted by Major Rudolph Anderson, was shot down over Cuba by a Soviet S-75 anti-aircraft missile. Anderson died. This was the first and only combat pilot killed during the crisis. His death caused outrage in the Pentagon, and many military officials insisted on immediate retaliatory strikes. Kennedy, however, showed restraint, deciding that the incident might have been the initiative of local commanders rather than an order from Moscow. The second, less known but potentially even more dangerous incident occurred in the depths of the Atlantic. American destroyers detected the Soviet diesel-electric submarine B-59, which was in the blockade area. Not knowing that nuclear torpedoes were on board, the Americans began dropping depth charges, signal charges, to force the submarine to surface. Under conditions of complete isolation, without communication with Moscow, and with high temperatures in the compartments, the submarine's command was in a state of extreme stress. According to Soviet protocol, the use of a nuclear torpedo required the consent of all 3 officers on board. Commander Valentin Savitsky, believing that war had already begun, insisted on using the weapon. However, Vasily Arkhipov, the second-in-command officer, convinced him to refrain and surface. His composure may have prevented a nuclear exchange. Only decades later did this episode become public knowledge, stunning historians with its drama. The third incident occurred on the same day in Cuba. An American U-2, piloted by Charles Maltzby, accidentally deviated from course and intruded into Soviet airspace over Chukotka. Soviet fighters were scrambled, and American F-102s, which took off to intercept, were armed with Air-2 Genie tactical nuclear missiles. A conflict in the Arctic nearly erupted parallel to the Caribbean one, but the pilot managed to return to base in Alaska, avoiding a clash. The key moment came on the 28th of October. The morning of this day was full of anxiety, but by evening, the situation began to resolve. In his broadcast to Havana, Khrushchev announced that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba. This was accepted as a victory for the United States of America, but behind this public statement lay a complex compromise. Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the missiles, but in return received a written promise from Kennedy that the United States of America would not invade Cuba. Thus, the crisis ended. The world was saved from nuclear war, but the price was enormous. Both sides realized how close they had come to the abyss. This experience would serve as an impetus for changes in communication methods and approaches to resolving future conflicts. The end of the Caribbean crisis, on the 28th of October 1962, did not mean its complete disappearance from the agenda. On the contrary, the consequences of this event had a profound and long-term impact on international relations, nuclear disarmament, and the internal politics of the involved countries. The process of withdrawing Soviet missiles from Cuba, a new level of communication between the superpowers, and subsequent international agreements became direct consequences of the experienced crisis. The process of dismantling and removing the missiles from Cuba began immediately after the public agreement. Soviet ships with equipment and missiles left the island in the period from the 5th to the 9th of November 1962. The dismantling of Soviet R-12 missile bases in the Caribbean region was carried out under the supervision of American experts, which guaranteed compliance with the agreements. This process took several weeks, but its successful completion became an important symbol of détente. For the United States of America, this meant the elimination of a direct nuclear threat hanging over their territory, and for the Soviet Union, the preservation of some face, and a demonstration of readiness for dialogue. It is important to note that although Kennedy publicly agreed only to non-aggression guarantees, in secret negotiations, an agreement was reached that the United States of America would withdraw its missiles from Turkey in exchange for the withdrawal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. This compromise helped Khrushchev relieve internal pressure and appear as a winner at home. One of the most significant and practical results of the crisis was the creation of a direct telephone link between Washington and Moscow, known as the Hotline. The reason for its creation was the realization by all participants of how slow and unreliable traditional diplomatic mail could lead to catastrophe under conditions of extreme tension. This direct line was established on the 20th of June 1963 and was intended to ensure instant communication between the President of the United States of America and the General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. Its purpose was to prevent future crises that might arise from misunderstanding or message delays. Although the hotline did not prevent other conflicts, it became an important psychological and technical tool, reducing the risk of accidental war. The crisis also had enormous significance for the nuclear disarmament movement. It vividly demonstrated the terrible consequences of the nuclear arms race and pushed both superpowers to seek ways to slow it down. As a result of the crisis, both sides showed heightened interest in concluding a comprehensive treaty banning nuclear tests. This interest led to the signing of the treaty banning nuclear weapon tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater, which was signed on the 5th of August 1963 in Moscow. The treaty was ratified and entered into force in September of the same year. The signing of this treaty became one of the most significant achievements in the field of nuclear nonproliferation and disarmament, and many historians believe that it was precisely the Caribbean crisis that served as a powerful catalyst for its achievement. The internal politics of the countries also underwent changes. In the United States of America, the Kennedy administration received unprecedented popularity thanks to the successful management of the crisis. The results of the November elections, where the Democrats won, can be interpreted as an expression of public approval of the president's actions. For Khrushchev, the situation was more complicated. Although he avoided war, his public acknowledgement of the mistake and retreat under pressure from the United States of America were used by his political opponents within the Politburo. Subsequently, these events, along with others, contributed to his resignation in 1964. For Cuba, the crisis meant the final consolidation of its status as an ally of the Soviet Union and ensuring protection from new invasions, but also an increase in dependence on Moscow. In the long-term perspective, the Caribbean crisis became a turning point in the Cold War. It put an end to the era of brinkmanship, the policy of pushing the opponent to the brink of war. After the crisis, both superpowers realized that nuclear war could have no winners and began striving for stability through deterrence and conflict management. This led to the era of détente in the 1970s, including such important treaties as the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, SALT I, 1972, and the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, ABM, 1972. Even after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the hotline continues to function, now between the United States of America and Russia, serving as a constant reminder that humanity once stared into the face of nuclear annihilation and recoiled at the last moment. The Caribbean crisis forever changed world politics, becoming a living lesson of how fragile peace can be in the era of nuclear weapons, and how crucial a role in its preservation is played not only by strategies and technologies, but also by human judgment, courage, and sometimes random luck. Thank you for watching this video to the end. If you liked it, give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Good luck and see you in the next episode.